You're watching Reality Check. A political controversy has broken out over the RBI's rupees 1.7 lakh crore windfall to the cash-strapped NDA government. Now, the RBI says that they were simply following the guidelines given to them by a committee known as the Jalan Committee, which essentially relaxed the rules that has allowed the RBI to transfer more of its funds to the government. But the Congress says that this is a raid on the RBI's reserves, a suggestion which the finance minister has dismissed as preposterous.
Now, any suggestion about the credibility of the Reserve Bank, therefore for me, seems a bit outlandish. Financial stability, surplus to meet any emergency and contingency have all been factored in by the committee when they arrived at the formulation of a formula. So, comments being given on the credibility of the Reserve Bank, I'm afraid, is commenting on the Reserve Bank itself and their selection of the committee itself and the committee independently arriving at a formula itself.
This government, we are charging it of monumental mismanagement of the Indian economy, which is now in a serious crisis. It is not a recession or a downturn. The situation is grim. India is now in the midst of the worst ever financial crisis, where the government is pushing the country towards bankruptcy. Because of its policies, the Prime Minister and the Minister, Finance Minister, cannot remain in denial, which they are.
Right, so that clash between the Congress and the government. So what really is the truth? Is this a raid on the RBI's autonomy and reserves? Or is this the RBI simply carrying out its mandate? The answers, as ever, are not easy because this involves complex financial policy, and we are still waiting for answers as to the source of all these funds. But from what we understand, just based on what we know on publicly available information, the amount itself has raised eyebrows because of the size of the jump. Now, in 2014, the RBI transferred about 66,000 crores to the government. That has jumped this year to 1.7 lakh crores, almost 3 times as much, a jump of 252%. But it's important to remember that this entire 1.7 lakh crores is not, in a sense, from the RBI's reserves. About 52,000 crores is, in a sense, from the RBI's reserves. These are its funds, its contingency funds, which it keeps for emergencies. Now, 52,000 crores has come from that thanks to the Bimal Jalan Committee. But the 1.2 lakh crores has come from the RBI's own profits. The profits are transferred every year to the government. This time, they seem to have jumped to 1.2 lakh crores. And this has happened essentially because the Jalan Committee has, in a sense, opened up the purse strings of the RBI. When it came to the contingency fund, earlier it was required to maintain 6.8%. That has now been lowered to between 6.5 to 5.5%, and the RBI has chosen to go with the lower end of that range, 5.5%. That's given the government 52,000 crores. And as far as the 1.2 lakh crores is concerned, again, thanks to the relaxation of norms by the Jalan Committee, it's allowed them to transfer that 1.2 lakh crores. And that's where the 1.7 lakh crore figure comes from. But that in itself has clearly not addressed the debate, which in fact has only widened. Okay, joining me tonight, I have on the show with me Dr. Rakesh Mohan. He's in fact one of the members of the Jalan Committee, distinguished economist. Also with us, Dr. Brinda Jagirdar. She's a former chief economist, SBI, and economist. Professor Jayati Ghosh, who teaches economic studies and planning at JNU. Neelkant Mishra is there, co-head of Asia Pacific Strategic and India Equity Strategist for Credit Suisse. And Amitabh Dubey, political analyst and also who is affiliated to the Congress party. Let me just start with you, Professor Rakesh Mohan, and just let's try and keep, and my request to all of you, let's try and keep this as simple as possible so it's easy for the ordinary viewer to understand that to this kind of building momentum or this kind of questions that are being raised about this huge amount being transferred, that this is a raid on the RBI's autonomy, they've put themselves at risk by dipping into their reserves because of what your committee recommended, how would you respond?
Well, first, Srinivasan, you might recall that the whole issue had arisen from the Economic Survey 2015-16, which then Chief Economic Advisor Arvind Subramanian had opined that the Reserve Bank had very highly excess reserves. And the numbers that were bandied around of excess reserves was something from 3 lakh to 9 lakh crores. Okay, so you have to remember that this was the context in which the committee was appointed, and also among the issues on which Dr. Urjit Patel resigned as the governor. Now, as I understand, the full committee report is going to be released tonight at some point. And so the best thing would be for people to actually look at that to understand what the committee has said. So having said that, first, the one point that it is in some sense somewhat misleading. Even the number is correct, of course, 1.76 lakh crores to be looking at to look at that as what the Jalan committee has recommended. That's not correct. The Jalan committee, what it did was to do a full-scale risk assessment of the Reserve Bank. Number one, it said that the revaluation reserves, which arise from the revaluation of the forex reserves of the Reserve Bank, since they are not realized profits, it's just an accounting entity of revaluation reserves, because as the rupee depreciates, the rupee value of the foreign exchange reserves go up, and therefore on the liability side, you have to have a balancing amount. So the first point is the Jalan Committee said very clearly that the revaluation reserves cannot be distributed, and that allows something, the number is I think between 20-25% of the balance sheet. So that's point number one, which you might recall
that's out of the picture.
That's extremely important, because many observers, including the former CEA, had indeed opined that could be distributed. That's where large numbers were coming from. Then what that then remains is the contingency risk buffer, where we gave the evaluation that it should be somewhere between 5.5 and 6.5% of the balance sheet, and the Reserve Bank Board has decided to take the lower bound. Now, one consequence of this, Srinivasan, is that since they've decided to take the lower bound 5.5%, now you just think of it next year, what happens. But next year, to keep the 5.5%, and since the balance sheet has been expanding by around 10% a year in nominal terms in the last 10 years, let's assume it expands by 10% this year as well. Just to keep it at 5.5 at this minimum level, the Reserve Bank will have to retain something around 20,000 crores from the surplus next year. What this means is that next year, whatever the surplus is, that the Reserve Bank, if they continue to abide by the committee's recommendations, they will not be able to distribute the full surplus and reduce it by 20,000 crores, something of that order. One other comment I'd like to make is that out of the 1.22 lakh crores, which is a surplus calculated in the for the Reserve Bank for 2018-19. So 28 has already been given in the last fiscal year as interim dividend. So all that then remains is 95 for this year. Okay. The last year, the total dividend that was given was 40 plus 28, that is 68. So in fact, assuming they don't give an interim dividend this year, that it'll actually go up from 68 to 90, not 3 or 2.5 times as you have mentioned. It'll go from 68, 2017, 18 to 95 for 2018-19. And the budget had about 90, so just 5,000 crores more than what was in the budget. So in some sense, there's nothing particularly sensational about it, as many people are saying.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Jayati Ghosh, how would you respond to that? That as Professor Mohan was explaining, this is pretty much all accounted for. There is an explanation for the amounts that have been transferred, and it's really nothing to get very alarmed about.
Well, I tend to agree with Rakesh. What I've read of the RBI committee report suggests that they have given certain boundaries and suggested that excess reserves, which the RBI is not using, can be transferred. I personally have no problem with that. I think that's fine. Macroeconomically speaking, that is exactly analogous to deficit financing. In the past, the government would borrow from the central bank, as it was called, in money creation. Now, the Reserve Bank gifts it some money. That's the difference. I personally don't have a problem with that. My problem is what they are going to do with the money. I think, unfortunately, the amount suggests that the government is using this simply as a way of covering up its massive mess in tax revenues, because it had clearly anticipated tax revenues that there is no way they will be able to meet. So this is actually a way of ensuring that they have some kind of a revenue basis on which to do the planned expenditures. Whether that's enough to revive the economy at this point, that is another question.
If I can just make a comment
Right.
on that, Srinivasan.
Okay, so your question.
Sorry, if I can just make a comment on that,
Go ahead, sir.
Srinivasan. Yeah. So that look, the RBI
Yes,
has
quickly,
always been transferring surpluses to the government. So there's no money creation here different from before. It's just the volume is larger because the profits are larger. The surplus is larger because the Reserve Bank last 20.
But Rakesh, we're talking money in circulation.
Just 1 second, Joyce. That in 2028 the surplus is much larger because in 2018-19 the Reserve Bank actually bought up almost 70% of government net borrowing, and therefore its stock of domestic government securities went up. The interest rate on domestic government securities is much higher than international securities, about 7% or something like that, and therefore it is a much larger profit. So all I'm saying is that there is no change.
Okay, that
in
was a question.
practice.
Okay, that's interesting that
I
you
think
were able to
my
explain
point
to
is
us
really
why
about
that
the
amount has gone
macroeconomic
up,
balances.
because there was some confusion about that. But okay, again a request to all of you very distinguished economists, let's not get too technical. But Jayati Ghosh, I take your wider point that your question is on how the government is going to spend it. We'll return to that in a second. But if I can just go across to Amitabh Dubey, because Amitabh Dubey, the Congress at the moment is not raising the question of how the government will spend it. They are calling this a raid on the RBI's reserves. They're saying this is hurting the RBI's economy, etc., etc. You just heard from Dr. Rakesh Mohan, who is part of the Jalan committee. Are you now convinced that perhaps the Congress may have jumped the gun?
See, Vasu, one of the concerns is about the institution itself and the fate of institutions under this dispensation. You will remember that Raghuram Rajan, as RBI governor, resisted this idea. Urjit Patel resigned over it, a man handpicked by Mr. Modi. Two past RBI governors have opposed this. And then finally, we found an RBI governor who was willing to go along with it. Some of the research produced by the RBI's own think tanks have come to a different conclusion, which is not to cast aspersions on the Jalan committee at all, but I'm saying that there are many different views in the RBI.
That's what
and
I was about
I'd
to
be
say.
curious about if
I was
Dr.
only,
Mohan... Sorry?
Yes. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Amitabh. Sorry.
I'd be curious. It was reported that the Jalan committee suggested that this surplus be transferred over a 3 to 5 year period, which I think from a fiscal point of view is more steady and doesn't seem quite so much to be a move of desperation. So I'd be curious to see if that is indeed the case, that the committee recommended a more graduated approach. But overall, it's sort of, I think there's a valid concern about how institutions are being treated by the Modi government and whether this is yet another example of that.
Would like me to answer
I
that,
see. Okay. Dr. Mohan, yes, very, very briefly,
Vasu,
and then I'll move on.
If I may
Yes,
say,
just-
I think
just-
all very briefly, nobody can have any illusions about RBI autonomy after demonetization. So I think we can put that particular thing to rest.
Let me
Okay,
just
sorry.
answer Amitabh's,
Dr. Mohan, yes. On the point about the graduated payment, yes.
So just 2 points. First, actually, Jalan committee report is not inconsistent with the Kafral report from RBI that he is mentioning. But that also that was Amartya Lahiri and co who had written that paper. That also had said that the revaluation reserve should not be distributed. That's exactly what the Jalan committee has done. And similarly, there's not hardly any difference between the contingency risk buffer of 5.5 to 6.5. My recollection of that paper is I think they came to something like 6.5 or something of that order. So there's no substantive difference between the RBI's Kafra paper and our report. Second, on the phased, the news reports on the phased distribution were absolutely incorrect. That was never considered by the committee because we did not go into the issue of how it should be distributed. And again, I'll repeat that the committee's conclusion is only to do with 50,000 crore, that is 1.3% of the balance sheet. The committee had, as far as surplus is concerned, by law it has to transfer the surplus.
All right, okay. Can I just bring in here Ms. Jagirdar? Now, would you want to respond to what Amitabh Dubey is saying, that the wider concern, Brinda Jagirdar, about the fact that when something like this happens, you see previous RBI governors who are more resistant to the idea of parting with more of the RBI's reserves being shown the door or exiting, and then along comes somebody who's seen as sort of less perhaps rigid, and then this huge amount gets transferred, and therefore there's a sort of bad faith around what has happened.
I think that discussion is not at all relevant here. I think what is most important is look at what the Jalan committee has studied and recommended. I think it's a very clearly thought through report, and very, very correctly the revaluation reserves have been kept out. Second thing, the contingency risk buffer. It's around 6.8%. The committee felt that perhaps 5.5 to 6.5 could be a good range, and the RBI felt that given the circumstances, 5.5 is good enough to manage the liquidity, monetary, credit risk, all the risks. So therefore, this amount that has come up, 52,000 crore, it's a one-time thing. And the third important point is that so far as the economic capital is concerned, it's about 23% of the RBI's balance sheet, and the committee felt that maybe 24% could be, in this range it could be. So given the comfort that it drew, the Reserve Bank has agreed to transfer the entire net income, and this year it earned a good net income, as Dr. Rakesh Mohan has very clearly explained. So I think it's very logical and very clear, and there's no need to mix up other issues with this. Let's look at it from a pure economic point of view, and I think the arguments are very clear.
Just, Srinivasan, if I can just make another comment.
Okay, let me just go across to Credit Suisse, to Neelkant Mishra. If I can just go to Neelkant, who's not had a chance to come in. Neelkant, let's now, because we have very little time, let's now shift to a point Jayati raised earlier. What is going to happen to this money, and is this enough to turn the economy around?
Look, in a slowing economy, when you have a fixed fiscal deficit target, this is what is called a very pro-cyclical fiscal target. What it means is that when an economy is slowing, the government's tax collections slow down. Because of that, but the necessity of meeting the fiscal deficit target is still there. They have to necessarily control expenditure, and this worsens the tax collections even further. So this is called what is called pro-cyclical, and the converse works as well. In a growing economy, an accelerating economy, the government's tax collections can do better than expected, and therefore it has room to spend more than it had expected, and that leads to a further acceleration in the economy. Anyway, so right now we are in the decelerating phase. The government's tax collections are running really short of its budgeted targets. To give you numbers, in GST, the government has estimated a 15% increase. In the first 3 months, the collection growth is about 6.7, 6.8%. And the problem is that all of this shortfall, while GST belongs to both states and center, all of this shortfall will be borne by the center. So I think there is a fiscal gap emerging because the tax collections are much slower than expected because the economy is decelerating. So this will go towards, I think, filling up that gap.
Right.
Just a couple of points.
Okay. Jaydeep.
One on the windfall. That look, the budget is already accounted for 90,000. Okay, so that's already in the budget figures. So the extra is 52 plus 5. That is from 95. So the extra is only 57,000, not 176, etc. 90,000 is already accounted for in the budget. So the question boils down to Yeah.
Okay, that's an important clarification.
Yeah, yeah. And the second other thing I want to point out
okay.
is just one other point, that former governors, when Raghuram Rajan was there, he for the first time actually decided to transfer the full surplus, because the Malagam committee had also found somewhat excess reserves. So what he had then said was there was no need to do any provisioning for 3 years. So Raghuram Rajan transferred the full surplus. Second, my guess, of course I wouldn't know, but my guess is that if the demand, if the argument had been around 1.3% of the reserves of the balance sheet, as we've talked about, as Jalan Committee recommended, my guess is that Urjit Patel would not have objected to that. The demands at that time were much higher.
Okay. Okay, fair enough. Jayati Ghosh, right. So Dr. Mohan says that a large chunk of it is already accounted for, but whatever the balance accrues to the government, what do you think they ought to do with it? Given where the economy is today.
Well, I know what they ought to do with it. I doubt very much. Yeah, I doubt very much they would do it. But I think what is very clear right now, we are facing a major crisis of inadequate demand. They should be spending more in terms of, let's say, doubling or tripling the spending on the employment guarantee, dramatically increasing social spending, all the things that have very large multiplier effects to revive demand. And focusing on those areas of the economy where you're likely to get the maximum bang for the buck in terms of immediate increases in spending to revive the market. At the moment, everything is down. You need to revive the demand from the bottom up. That would generate the investment. I doubt they will do that, however.
Amitabh Dubey? Okay.
Yeah.
Amitabh Dubey, you think that's going to happen?
No, I mean, I think a lot of the talk is about recapitalizing the banks, and this government particularly likes infrastructure spending, which they're doing a fair amount of. The problem being that in this day and age, infrastructure spending has a pretty low employment multiplier, because a lot of it has now become automated, highways and so on and so forth. So I agree with Professor Ghosh. I think they should go in the direction of reviving. You know, unemployment is at a 45-year high. Household savings are down to a 23-year low.
Okay.
So these are very serious issues that need to be addressed and haven't yet been addressed.
Right. Okay. Brinda Jagirdar, what would you like the government to do with this money? Specifically.
I think the government has already said it's going to put in 70,000 crores for recapitalizing the public sector banks. And so that in turn would lead to, say, more than 5 lakh crore of lending. So that would add to the liquidity in the economy, and banks would lend to NBFCs, to MFIs, and that I think would create a multiplier effect for demand and investment.
Okay. Professor Mohan? Very briefly from you, I know that that this is not your remit was the Jalan committee, but I'm asking you just as an economist.
No, absolutely. I would say one that
policy person. Where would you like? How would you like this money? How would you like to see the government deploy this money?
Yeah. Well, as you may possibly recall, I've done a fair amount of work on infrastructure, and so I would certainly say that whatever extra money that the government is getting that is unexpected should go into extra infrastructure investment, and I would say particularly in the railways. Now, I realize, as Jayati is saying, that this won't lead to a great degree of immediate employment gains. But I think that as the investment is down in the country, it's about a 15-year low. Similarly, as also been mentioned, savings are down as about a 20-year low. That it is extremely important to get growth going. Yes, that the employment impact will of course then take some time. That I do agree with. But my preference would be to invest for growth in the country, which will generate more permanent jobs across the years.
Okay, well, excellent suggestions all around. But that's all the time we have on Reality Check. Thank you all so much for joining us. That's been fascinating. We'll have to leave it there. Good night.